They say time heals everything, that endings are just new beginnings, that walking away from a broken marriage is freedom, relief, even rebirth. But for some, the story doesn't unfold that way. Because when the papers are signed and the silence settles in, something deeper begins to unravel. Not just a relationship, but an identity. A sense of self that once felt stable, now dissolving quietly beneath the surface. Why do some people move on while others seem to fall apart completely? Why does divorce for some feel less like an ending and more like an emotional collapse? There is a hidden grief here, one rarely spoken about. A silent disintegration that happens behind closed doors. This is the psychology of those who don't just lose a partner, but lose themselves in the process. Let's begin. There's a quiet truth rarely spoken about. You don't just love a person, you become someone through them. Over time, the relationship begins to shape the edges of your identity. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, like water carving stone. You are no longer just you. You are a partner, a spouse, a shared routine, a familiar role in someone else's world. Your mornings, your decisions, your future plans, woven together so tightly, it becomes difficult to tell where you end and they begin. And then, one day, it's gone. Not just the person, but the structure that once held your life in place. So, what happens when that structure disappears? Who are you when no one is there to reflect you back to yourself? This is where many begin to fall apart, not out of weakness, but because the foundation they stood on was never just their own. Divorce doesn't simply take away a relationship, it strips away the roles that gave your life coherence. The we becomes me, and sometimes me feels unfamiliar, even empty. There's no script for this part, no clear identity to step into. Just a silence where meaning used to live. And in that silence, a quiet question echoes. If you are no longer who you were with them, then who are you now? There is a kind of grief that doesn't look like grief. It doesn't always arrive with tears or visible sorrow. Sometimes it hides behind numbness, behind forced smiles, behind the quiet phrase, "I'm okay." Because the world often treats divorce as a choice, and choice somehow is expected to feel empowering. But what is rarely acknowledged is that even chosen endings can carry unbearable loss. You are not just grieving a person, you are grieving everything that person represented. The future that was imagined, now erased. The plans that once felt certain, now dissolved into uncertainty. The small, ordinary moments, shared meals, familiar conversations, now echoing as absence. And perhaps most painfully, you are grieving the version of yourself that existed within that connection. The one who felt understood, the one who belonged. But this grief is complicated because it is often mixed with relief, with guilt, with questions that have no clear answers. Was it the right decision? Could something have been saved? Why does it still hurt if it was necessary? So instead of being expressed, this grief is often buried, pushed down to make space for strength, silenced to appear moved on. But unspoken grief does not disappear. It lingers, quietly shaping your emotions, your thoughts, your sense of safety. Like an invisible weight carried alone. And over time, that weight begins to pull you inward, not because you are broken, but because something inside you is still trying to be acknowledged, still trying to be felt. There is a moment after loss when the mind understands what happened, but the body does not. Everything feels off, unfamiliar, unstable in a way that words cannot fully explain. Because divorce is not just emotional, it is physiological. To the nervous system, a long-term relationship is more than companionship. It is safety, a predictable presence, a rhythm the body learns to trust. And when that disappears, the system does not simply adjust, it reacts. Sleep becomes restless or absent. Thoughts race without permission. The chest tightens for no clear reason. Even silence begins to feel loud. Why does something that is already ended still feel like it is happening again and again inside you? Because the body holds on to what the mind is trying to release. The absence of that person becomes a kind of signal, interpreted not just as loss, but as danger. And so the nervous system stays alert, scanning, replaying, trying to make sense of what no longer exists. This is why moving on doesn't feel simple, why logic cannot calm what the body perceives as threat. You may tell yourself, it's over, but your system whispers, something is wrong. And in that tension between what you know and what you feel, a quiet exhaustion begins to grow. Not because you are failing to cope, but because your body is still trying to survive something it hasn't yet understood how to let go of. There is a conflict that begins quietly, not with noise, but with contradiction. One part of you wants to move forward, to rebuild, to let go of what no longer exists. But another stays behind, holding on to fragments, replaying conversations, rewriting endings that can no longer be changed. And so, an invisible tension forms. You tell yourself it was necessary, yet something in you resists that truth. You remember the reasons it ended, yet your mind drifts back to what once felt right. Why does the heart return to places the mind has already left? Because closure is not a single moment. It is a slow negotiation between opposing emotions. There may be guilt for what was said or left unsaid. There may be anger for what was lost or never fully given. And beneath it all, a quiet self-blame that asks, was it something within you that made it fall apart? This is the inner war, a cycle of thoughts that circle endlessly, not to find answers, but to hold on to something familiar. Even pain, when repeated long enough, begins to feel like certainty. And certainty, strangely, can feel safer than the unknown. So the mind clings, not because it wants suffering, but because it fears emptiness. Moving on begins to feel like betrayal. Letting go feels like erasing something that once mattered. And in that space, between holding on and trying to release, you remain suspended. Not fully in the past, not fully free from it either. Just in between. There comes a point when the breaking no longer feels sharp. Not because the pain is gone, but because it has settled, like dust after a storm. The chaos inside begins to soften. The questions grow quieter. And in their place, something unfamiliar appears. Space. At first, that space feels empty, uncomfortable, almost threatening in its stillness. But slowly, it begins to change. Because what once felt like emptiness was never truly empty. It was simply untouched. This is where something subtle begins to unfold. Not a sudden transformation, but a quiet reconstruction. Not the rebuilding of who you used to be, but the discovery of who you are without the weight of who you had to be. Without roles, without expectations, without the constant reflection of another. And that can feel disorienting. because for so long your identity was shaped in relation to someone else. Now it must form from within. There is no clear blueprint here, no instant clarity, just small moments. Moments where you respond differently, where you notice your own thoughts without judgment, where you begin to recognize yourself not as someone incomplete, but as someone unfolding. And perhaps for the first time in a long time, you are not becoming who you were. You are becoming someone new. Not suddenly, not perfectly, but honestly. And maybe falling apart was never the end of your story. Maybe it was the beginning of meeting yourself without anything in between. If something quiet inside you was touched while listening to this, if parts of this reflection felt familiar, then perhaps what you've been experiencing was never weakness. Perhaps it was the weight of something deeply human. Losing a relationship like this doesn't just change your life, it changes the way you see yourself, the way you feel safety, the way you exist in your own world. And if it has felt overwhelming at times, if it has felt like you've been slowly unraveling, you are not alone in that experience. There are many who carry this same quiet storm within them, who smile on the outside while something inside is still trying to make sense of the loss. And maybe, just hearing that, brings a small sense of relief. If you'd like to stay connected to this space, a place where these unspoken emotions are gently explored, where the hidden corners of the human experience are given language, you're always welcome here. And if you feel comfortable, you can share your thoughts below. Not because you have to, but because sometimes your words might help someone else feel a little less alone in theirs. Take care of yourself. You deserve gentleness.